Today we're going to talk about Audient signal flow. It's kind of a, we're kind of going over what we talked about yesterday. Yesterday was like an introduction to the Audient, and today we're kind of diving in deeper to a lot of those sections that we talked about yesterday. So let's go ahead and get started here. All right, so just a quick refresher. Yesterday we talked about the input path and the monitor path. This is the whole recording signal. We've got two parts to it. We've got the input part and we've got the monitor part. The input part is where we're actually recording into the computer, and the monitor part is what we're listening to make sure there's no problems. So on the input path, remember you've got your source here, and the source has a vocal, drum, guitar, keyboard. It could be anything, something like that kind of stuff. And that's transmitted through the air or through a cable or something like that. And then we have, that goes into a mic or a DI box. Remember we talked about DI boxes yesterday. If it's a vocal or something like that, or a guitar or whatever, it's going to go into an amp, and that's going to be projected through the speaker cabinet and all that stuff. It's going to go into the mic or the DI. Then that's going to go from a cable in the mic or into the DI into an amplifier, brings up the signal, something like that. Now, if you are playing a guitar or a bass, you're going to have the first three things, and you're going to have those again. So it's going to have, like, the guitar will be the source, and that's going to go into a DI box, which could go into the amplifier, and that's going to get turned up and projected, and then the microphone's going to pick that up, and then you're going to go into the amplifier into the back of the console. Or if you have a preamp, you can use that as well. So then that is assigned or selected to the channel, and on the Audient, you do it a couple different ways on different boards. On the Audient, you're going to do it just by plugging it into the proper input, and that's going to go to the right channel immediately. If you're on the O2R, you could plug it into an input and then reroute that internally within the O2R, but we're going to talk about that in a couple weeks. The channel has your EQ, pan, faders, Aux Sends, that kind of stuff there, and that's like all there on the channel strip there. Those things can be inserted into the signal or left out of the signal depending on which console you have. Then you route it into the group out or to the direct out. So if you're on the Audient, it's going to be the group out. If you're on the O2R, it's the direct out. The group out is a routing matrix. So we can take that signal, we can route it to different places. The direct out is a straight output out of that channel. So if you're coming into channel 1, the direct out is going to be channel number 1. If you're on the Audient, you can, as we saw yesterday, you can take that group out from the routing matrix, and you can come into channel number 1, and then you can go out to channel number 5 or something like that. So we're going to dive in deeper into that today. And that is a cable that's connected up to your MTR, your multi-track recorder, which would be your, in our case, it's the computer interface, the DAW. But it could also be an ADAT, or it could be tape. So that's the overview there. Let's see here. Who just showed up? Elijah. Hold on 1 second. Let me just mark these people. Oh yeah, Gio, you put your name in a second ago, and I missed it. Where are you? There you are. Cool. Amir and Jason. Excuse me. All right. So let's go on to the next one. This is the monitor path. The monitor path includes, it's basically the opposite direction of what we just did. So first step is the multi-track recorder. That's what we're listening to. We're broadcasting from. That can be our computer interface and DAW, or the ADAT, or the tape machine, whatever we've been recording onto. Probably these days it's going to be a DAW. So that has a cable that patches you back into your console, and this time you're coming into the line in or the tape in. The O2R has a line input, and that can be for keyboards or whatever, and the Audient has a tape input, but you can also plug a keyboard into that. Basically, that's the line level. The knob on there is not a gain knob, it's actually just like an attenuation type of thing. And we'll talk about the difference of that in a little bit here. And that goes into your channel, and again, whatever that's plugged into, that's going to assign it to the channel, unless you're on the O2R, in which case you could reroute that if you wanted to. But best just to keep things one-to-one. So if you're coming into channel 1, have it, or input number 1 go into channel number 1 is the best way to do that. And then the channel, again, it's the same type of stuff. It's got an EQ, a pan, a fader, Aux Sends. Sometimes it has a compressor. It depends on what console you're using. Then you use a button to route that to the left-right mix bus, and that's a button on the Audient. It just says mix, and that goes into the left-right mix bus, and that sends it basically to the master fader. And this is the part that you're recording. So this part here, you can see I've got like a nice little thing down here on the left-hand side that says 2-track recorder, and that 2-track recorder, what that means basically is that that's where we're recording. That's where we're making the actual recording. Now, what you have to keep in mind with all this stuff is this part right here, the 2-track recorder. Essentially, the whole point of a console like this is so it can mix multiple things together. It's the same thing as what you've got going on inside of Pro Tools or Ableton Live, Logic, those kinds of things, except it's hardware. So if you have multiple pieces of gear, you have to use hardware to mix them all together. But the point is the same, is that we're making a recording that we can send to our friends, or we can play for our parents, or you can send to the record label, or wherever you're doing it, play it in the club. But you have to bounce that down. You have to get that into stereo, left and right, a stereo file. And in order to do that on a computer, you just hit bounce and it bounces it down. But if you're using hardware, everything is outside of the computer, or at least some of it's outside of the computer. You have to bounce that down in real time, which means you have to record it onto something. And that's what this 2-track recorder is doing. This 2-track recorder is where you actually do the recording and you bounce it out in real time. All right, so let me just see what is going on here. Seems like we're lagging a bit today. Let me just turn this off. I'm going to go ahead and let's see, did that fix things? Nope. Hold on one second. We're going to fix that. It does not seem to like having all these. Here, I'm just going to unplug you. Give me 1 second here, y'all. Not super happy. Come on. There we go. Is that better? Maybe that's better. All right, well, we'll see what happens. All right, so where were we? Okay, so the 2-track recorder. So the 2-track recorder is fed from the left-right mix bus. Then we have a button that can assign that to the, it goes to the control room, which is what we're actually going to listen to. And then that control room has a level knob on it, so we can turn it up, turn it down. And I just want to point out here that the 2-track recorder is not in the same signal path as the control room. The control room is, sorry, it is in the same signal path, but it's before the control room. What does that mean? That means that your control room, you can turn the level up and down without affecting the level going into your 2-track recorder. So be aware of that. Your 2-track recorder, if you turn the control room level up and down, it's not going to be affected. The level in the 2-track recorder is not going to be affected. But with your master fader, if you turn that up and down, you can see the master fader is before the 2-track recorder. Remember, all this stuff, the order is important. The order is very important here. So if you turn your master fader down or your master fader up, you are effectively changing the level of the recording. And that's why I said yesterday, put your master fader all the way up and just leave it there and adjust things with the mix. The master fader, you shouldn't really turn it down unless you're doing a fade out at the end of the song. All right, so we got our control level here and control room level, and that goes directly into our speakers. It's hardwired with the cable. You're probably not going to change that around later on. And the speakers includes an amplifier and the speaker. We often think of speakers just being one unit, and they are in one box a lot of times with powered monitors these days. But in fact, there's 2 components inside there. There's your speaker, which is actually what we hear, and there's your amplifier, which powers the speaker. So keep that in mind. I'm not going to beat you over the head with that today, but it is something that you gotta remember. All right, how are we doing over here? Smooth? Yes, we're smooth. Good. And then let's just see. Go over here to this one here. All right. Cool. All right, still good. Okay, so we're going to go over this stuff again real quick here. We got the input path. This is what the back of the Audient looks like. So number 1 here is our microphone input. Number 2 is the line input, and the microphone is for microphones. This goes into the preamp, and the line input also goes into a preamp, but you're probably, depending on what you're using with this, you're not going to have to amplify it, or you're probably not going to have to amplify it. And then you got our send and returns. We're going to come back and talk about that on a different day. Over here we've got the tape input. The tape input does not go into the amplifier. Okay, some boards do not have differences between these, and some boards do. So for example, the O2R does not have a tape input. It just has a line input. So you have to make a choice with each channel input on the back. If you want to plug in a keyboard or something like that, you can, or you can plug in the return from your tape machine. But with the Audient, you don't have to make that choice. With the Audient, you can have a keyboard plugged into the back and a line input, and you can also have the tape machine plugged into the back, and that's because it's an inline console. All right, we've got our, over here, this is our input pod section, and we've got the long meter and the short meter, and number 6 can switch between those. And then number 3 here engages your insert for your tape. There we go, make that a little bit clearer to see. So number 3 here is your insert for your tape input here, and we can see here this is our tape input. So this number 4 here is not an actual gain knob, it's just an attenuation knob, which means that it's not going to power the speaker even more, power the sound even more. It just allows us to turn it down and kind of like make sure that it's not, everything is coming at us at once. Number 5, this is our actual input section here, this kind of darker area here. And what this does is number 5 switches between your microphone input and your line input. So if you've got a microphone plugged into it, then you would have the button up. But if you have a line signal coming in, like if you're using another preamp, an external preamp or something like that, then you're going to push that button down. Number 6 here is the MTR button. In this case, remember, MTR does not stand for multi-track recorder. It stands for meter, and that just flips numbers 1 and 2 so you can see your recording signal better. Number 7 is your insert in there. Now, just real quick, we keep seeing this insert here. An insert, what that is like a compressor or an EQ. If you have an external EQ or compressor or something like that, that's going to be an insert effect. Basically the same as what your insert effects are on Pro Tools or Logic or Ableton Live. In this case, of course, it's hardware, so we have to tell the hardware to look for those insert effects. So if you have something plugged into your machine, you can push that button and utilize it. Again, we're going to come back and talk about these in depth, but I just wanted to kind of just address it just so you're not completely wondering what that is for. Number 8 is your gain knob, and this is if you're using a preamp. This is what really makes a big difference in mic pre's, how clean, how nice they are. More expensive ones are usually cleaner and nicer sounding. This one is pretty okay. So what you do is you plug the mic in and you get the signal coming in, and you turn this level up so that you can until you can see the level being nice and the meters bop into the right place on number 1 there. And number 8 is where you're actually turning that up. Okay. Number 9 is your phase shift. So if you are recording like a snare drum, for example, and you feel like the snare drum is losing some of its like thickness, well, that might be because you're out of phase. And what happens with phasing is that the sound waves reach the microphones at different times, and they'll phase cancel each other. So the phases end up being at opposite ends of the spectrum from each other, and that cancels out the phase. And so if you feel like that's happening, then you can hit the number 9 button there and flip the phase on this one channel, and that should pop it back into phase. Now, a lot of people will say, well, Tony, how do I know what that phase cancellation thing sounds like? And it just comes from listening to stuff. And we can check that out a little bit later. We can talk about that more. You're definitely going to talk about that more in Module 3. So I don't really want to go too much into it because you are going to have that covered. Next mod is really learning how to listen to this stuff. But that's what that does. Number 10 is your phantom power. That's for your condenser microphones. Any microphone that's a condenser mic, you're going to need phantom power for it. Now, number 10, it's really important that you do not use the phantom power for ribbon microphones. Phantom power will destroy 90% of the ribbon microphones out there. There are a couple of ribbon microphones that are designed so they don't get killed by phantom power, but don't take that chance. You basically want to just, not use phantom power for ribbon microphones. Dynamic microphones, it doesn't really matter if you have the phantom power on or off. It's not going to hurt it. You want to keep it off as much as possible if you don't need it, but if you did turn it on by mistake with a dynamic mic, you're going to be fine. If you turn it on by mistake with a ribbon mic, you're going to have to go buy another ribbon mic or get that one fixed. Okay, number 11 is your low cut. It's just going to cut the low frequencies out. Usually those are set around 70 hertz, 80 hertz, something like that. All right, let's just check in, make sure we're good. Cool. All right, sorry. Silence or absence. I didn't see when you wrote that in. I don't have this up on my screen. I guess I'm going to put that right there. Silence or absence. What was I talking about? Sorry. Damien, can you say that again, what you were actually talking about here with the silence or absence part? Because I didn't. Oops. If you remember. Oh, the phase. It's not going to make it silent. So the phase, if you have phase cancellation, it depends on the frequency. If you're like lower frequencies, phase cancellation is gonna like cut the low end out entirely. But for the mid frequencies, snare drums don't really get down low enough for that to be an issue. That's more for like bass sounds. But a snare drum, you're gonna hear it doesn't have as much kind of it doesn't have as much weight to the snare drum. It's not going to be absent or gone. It's just not going to have as much weight. So it's something, and it's really the type of thing where you kind of have to listen to it to really hear what I'm talking about. And like I said, it's not. We can take a look at it at some point. It's not really a mod 2 thing. It's more of a mod 3 thing where you're talking about the boards and recording and stuff like that a little bit more. But we can, if we have time, take a look at it another day. But most of the big consoles have a phase button, and you can use, you have phase plugins and stuff like that on your computer. So, is it true that if you don't turn off phantom power before you unplug a condenser mic, it gets damaged? It's a possibility. It's not necessarily going to damage it automatically, but you definitely want to turn the phantom power on and off. You want to plug in the mic first and then turn on the phantom power, and then before you unplug the mic, you want to turn off the phantom power. For sure, is the right way to do things. Actually, we're going to talk about the proper order of events for powering up and powering down a studio. We're going to be talking about that one of these days. So we're going to come back to that specific question on a different day. But just to answer it real quick, if you want to plug in the microphone and then turn on the phantom power, and then also turn the phantom power off and then unplug the microphone is the proper order for that. So I hope I answered these questions a bit, but if you have more questions about it, just write a note to yourself on your phone, your computer, or whatever, and we can come back and talk about it and discuss this in the Zoom meeting. All right. So here, let me just adjust this. Cool. Okay. So and then Amir says, is the stream lagging for anyone else? Hopefully not. I know whatever it was lagging yesterday should be fixed today. I don't have. We should be good today. All right. So number 1 here is the routing matrix. And then the routing matrix is what sends it out from our board to our multi-track recorder, or you could have it for whatever else. The routing matrix also has to do with our busing in the Audient, but we're going to come back and talk about that later. For today, I just want to focus a little bit on what the routing matrix does for sending stuff to Pro Tools. And again, we're going to come back and talk about this stuff, but essentially, Pro Tools and the Audient, especially the Audient at SAE, we have 24 outs on the Audient at SAE, and we have 24 inputs into the computer at SAE in New York City. So we have all channels. Every channel that you plug into, you can record it into Pro Tools, and you can also send out from Pro Tools to mix on the Audient. So you have a mix, you can actually do up to 24 channels of your mix on the Audient at SAE in New York City. How do we assign these to go to the inputs on the DAW? Well, that's what this routing matrix is for. Channels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 here are, when you push the buttons, it's going to go to that channel. So if I'm coming into channel 4 on my Audient and I want to record into the input number 4 on Pro Tools, I just push that number 4 button and it records into input number 4 on Pro Tools. So what you have to do when you're recording stuff in the Audient is you make sure you take a note of what channel you're coming into, and then that channel, you're going to see everything happening on that channel, and you're going to push the routing matrix button for the same channel. And then on Pro Tools, what you do is you set up the input. So you go to your channel in Pro Tools and you set the input to say number 4. And that's going to have it coming in, so you're going to start to see signal happening because you've routed out from number 4 in the routing matrix, and then Pro Tools is listening to channel number 4. Now, when you go back from Pro Tools, what you're going to do, you don't have to use the routing matrix in the Audient for the monitor path. All you have to do is send out of the correct channel on the Audient, in Pro Tools, and that's going to come into that channel number in the Audient. Okay. I know it's a lot to take in. It's a lot of like stuff flying around in your brain about, wait, okay, I push this button to go to here, and this goes to here, and then I have to set this up and this up. It's not actually that hard, but it's just a lot of this and that and the other and blah, 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 all that stuff there. So it will maybe take you a little bit to wrap your head around at first, but the good news is that once you get it, you get it. It's like riding a bicycle. It's actually not that hard to do, but you just have to get your brain over that hump. And once your brain is over the hump, then you're never going to really forget it. It always comes back. So we've got here the routing matrix, and then so 1 through 12 are the just regular buttons. And then if I want to get to 13 to 24, I have to push number 2 here. What that means basically is you cannot use channels 1 through 12 and 13 through 24 at the same time. You can either do 1 through 12 or 13 through 24. The good news is it doesn't matter. You're never going to try to push channel 1 and channel 15. There's no reason to do that. Usually each channel is only going to one output on the routing matrix. So channel 1 would be number 1, channel 2 would be number 2, channel 3 would be number 3, channel 4 would be number 4, that kind of stuff like that. Okay. Now, buttons numbers 3 and 4. Let's not worry about those right now, but too much. I don't want to go into detail. But number 4, what it does is it sends the long fader, which is the monitor path, signal to the routing matrix. The reason why we would use that is subgroup mixing. And then number 3 is for panning that signal, which is when we would use that. So if you push the button for number 4, which is our monitor path, then you would also use number 3. But if you don't push number 4, you're not going to use number 3. They're kind of connected together. All right, number 5 is our Aux Sends. How much we're sending to our auxes is right here. 1 and 2, we can see 1 and 2. There's also 3, 4, 5, and 6. There are 6 Aux Send knobs, but there are actually 12 Aux Sends, and the way you get to the other 6 is by pushing the button for the alternative ones. So you have 1 and 2, then 3 and 4, then 5 and 6, and you push the button 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, like that. Now, one thing I want to point out here, and we can see it from this section right here actually, is that these are set up here, color coding. So the input path by color coded is a darker color, and the monitor path is the lighter color. We can see this is like a dark green kind of color, and then this is a grayish kind of color, gray, and then you got the purple here. So it's a dark green and kind of lighter green, and then we've got the gray and the purple color. So gray is our monitor path, and the darker color is our input path. And that follows the whole board, and that's our default settings for these things. So for example, we can see the routing matrix is a darker color. That's our input path. By default, it's the input path. But if I push this LF button, which stands for long fader, then it becomes part of the monitor path. That might be a little bit confusing at first, but what it does is it helps make everything easier for you to understand when you're actually looking at the board. So any section that is a lighter background is going to be for the monitor path, and any section that is a darker background is going to be for the input path. I point that out because here, when we're talking about our auxes and when we're talking about our effects, it helps us to remember, is that from the input path or the monitor path? And by default, these aux sends are on the monitor path. So we have here aux 1 and 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We can flip that to 7 and 8. Those are on the monitor path. So essentially, if I wanted to send my vocal to a reverb, I can do that using these aux sends here. If I wanted to send my vocal to the reverb coming from the input path, so let's say, for example, that my singer is in there and they're singing and they say, I want a little bit of reverb on my voice so I can record and I can hear some reverb on my voice. You would say, okay, cool. What you do is you push the number 6 button here, the SF button, and what that does is it flips those two aux channels to go from the input path. So the SF button says short fader. So now what's going to happen is those buttons are going to go from the short fader, which is the input path, to our reverb. So they're not going to be no longer will they be in the path for the they'll be in the monitor path. They're going to be on the input path. Number 7 here is pre-fader. That's for our headphone mix or our monitor mix. And number 8 here is to flip it to 7 and 8. So again, kind of like our routing matrix here, you can only use 2 of these aux sends at a time here. And remember, there are 3 sets of these. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But you can't use aux 1 and aux 7 at the same time. You can only use aux 1 or aux 7. But again, it's enough because that means there's 6 auxes for you to use on any channel at the same time. That's plenty. Number 9 down here are the same as auxes. They are essentially auxes, but they're specialized auxes made specifically for a headphone mix, and this is called the Fullback section. So number 9, A and B are the Fullback send amount here, and again, the default setting is for our monitor mix, but we can push it, the button here that says SF for the short fader, which would be the input path. And you always want to press the pre button on these. Usually on auxes 1 through 12, you do not want to push the pre button, but for the Fullback, because we have a dedicated headphone mix section, almost always you're going to push the pre button on those, so it's pre-fader. All right, moving right along. Before we continue, let me just get this here. So we got Martin and where's my, there we are. Martin and Jason. Cool. All right. Okay, so here we've got our EQ section, and the EQ section once again is set up to be from the monitor path by default. We can tell that because it's got a lighter background. So look at number 1 here, that is the in button. It's the same button as number 7. And what I just want to point out here is the EQ section is set up into 2 sections. We got the shelf section and we got the fully parametric EQ section. So the shelf section has a high shelf and a low shelf, high frequency, low frequency, that's what that stands for. And we can push the in button and it just affects this section right here. And basically what this does is it just gives us a shelf EQ, and you got the gain knob number 4 and number 6 here is the gain knob for this. And you can choose which frequency where your shelf is going to be with number 3 and number 5. Again, we have a button so it can go into input path if we want it to, and that's the button number 2 here. This button says SF, which stands for short fader, which essentially is going to put it into the input path. Now, here's the thing about both of these EQs, is that if you insert it into the input path, what's going to happen? You're going to be recording that EQ into your multi-track recorder. So if I have a kick drum, and I've got the kick drum going, and I've got some like low frequency adjustment, I've got some low mid adjustment going on there, well, those adjustments are going to be put into the recording if I choose my short fader button. But if I leave it up, it's not going to go into the multi-track recorder, it's just going to go into our final 2-track bounce. So if you want to record your kick drum with the EQ sound on it, and you want to have that EQ sound permanently in the kick drum, then use this on the short fader. But if you don't want to have it permanently in the kick drum, then use it on the long fader. My advice is keep it on the monitor path and use plugins for stuff, because you're going to have a lot of good plugins that you can utilize for that. Okay, midsection here is, these are fully parametric EQs, which means that they have a frequency knob and a gain knob and a width knob, so you can actually utilize it for more frequencies here. So you got your bandwidth right there. So number 9 is your selector of the frequency, and you can see you got the high, mid, and the low mid here, different frequencies, and you can just see which ones they are. And then you've got your gain knob here, and your number 13 is your gain knob, and then you've got your bandwidth adjuster for number 11 and 14. And so if it's over to the right, it's going to affect more bands. It's going to be a gentler slope, and it's more of a general EQ sound. But if you really need some precision to get in and really just tackle one frequency, then you're going to turn it to the left. So that's how that works there. All right, let's talk a little bit about EQs here for a second. EQs basically give us independent gain adjustment for specific groups of frequencies. That's what an EQ does. And this is a really important thing to remember, and something we've talked about in our other classes, is that the EQs, essentially, it's a gain knob for that frequency. So if you turn it up, you're actually pushing the level for that frequency. If you turn it down, you're taking away the level for that frequency. In general, you want to always turn things down, and you're going to use what we call subtractive EQing. It's very similar to the principles we talked about with subtractive mixing before. But essentially, if you use subtractive EQing, you're never going to run into a situation where you're pushing your gain so much that you end up taking out your headroom. Now, you can't always do that. Sometimes you do have to push the EQ a bit. But just be aware that when you're pushing the EQ, you may have to turn your fader down a little bit to compensate for that. So be aware of that. And we can talk about that more. I've already talked about it before in the past. This is just kind of everything's written down a little bit here. So the EQ types we have is low cut, low shelf, bell, high shelf, and high cut. And these basically are just different, these are general EQ types. This is not specific to the Audient. The Audient, what the Audient has is the low shelf, bell, and high shelf. It does have a low cut on the input pod, and that's a low cut filter. But different EQs in the world, which you've already encountered because you're using Pro Tools or Logic, Ableton Live, those programs, they have these different types of EQs. So this is not just the EQs on the Audient, this is just EQs in general. A low cut, what this does is it cuts out all frequencies below a certain point. A low shelf lets you adjust the frequency, the gain on all frequencies below a certain point, and you can usually adjust where that shelf is. The bell is your parametric EQ or fully parametric EQ, and it adjusts the gain on frequencies in the middle. The high shelf adjusts the gain on all frequencies above a certain point, and the high cut cuts out all frequencies above a certain point. Usually you can adjust where those low cut and high cut filters go. So let's take a look here at the bell EQ, and this is our parametric EQ, and this can be parametric or fully parametric. Parametric adjusts the gain on a sweepable range of frequencies. So, for example, your Mackie 1604, the mid, is probably a parametric EQ. It has your gain knob, and then it has a frequency knob there as well. Whereas the Audient is fully parametric, and this is the same as the parametric, but what it does is it adds your bandwidth control in there as well. So it adjusts the gain and bandwidth on a sweepable range of frequencies. So we have here, this one here, you can see you can go left and right, and then you can also adjust your bandwidth here. Wide bandwidth encompasses more frequencies, and narrow bandwidth encompasses less frequencies. Really what you want to generally you're going to use that wider bandwidth and just kind of gently shape the sound with that. But if you have some kind of specific frequency that's really messing with your mix, then you can use that narrow spectrum there. But in general, usually you want to stick with the wide ones. And then the three controls on a fully parametric EQ would be the gain knob, the frequency knob, and the bandwidth. And you can notice these immediately because the gain is going to say decibels, The frequencies is going to say kilohertz, and the bandwidth is usually going to have a picture of the bandwidth like that, like a narrow or wide type of little image. The shelf EQ adjusts all frequencies below or above a certain point. If it's below, it's going to be a low shelf. If it's above, it's going to be a high shelf. All the frequencies are going to be adjusted there. So be aware of what you're doing, especially if you're trying to boost your low end. You might not want to be boosting that low end so much for everything. Usually the high end is a good one to use. And you can use the low end as well, but you just got to be aware that low end is where a lot of the energy from the song comes from. So just be careful with that. On a shelf EQ, usually you have two controls, the gain and the frequency, and sometimes you might have a Q control, which also adjusts the shelf slope. So it can be more gentle or more wide. It's very similar to the bandwidth knob over here, in that the lower setting usually adjusts like more frequencies, like a gentler slope, and the higher setting. But it kind of depends on what kind of EQ it is, and not all shelf EQs have that bandwidth knob or Q knob. So here it just talks a little bit about subtractive EQing. Turn down the elements that are too loud to isolate the frequencies you want to hear more of. Don't keep turning things up. If you want to hear something louder, remember you can turn everything down around it to make that element louder. All right? So keep that in mind. So for example, if I have a kick drum and I want it to be more bassy, well, I'm not going to necessarily boost the bass, although you might do that sometimes. But you might just turn down, like, shave off the high frequencies, so give it a darker sound. I like to think of things in terms of dark and bright, darker, lighter, and that helps me to not just be like bassier. The kick drum necessarily doesn't need to be bassier most of the time. Kick drums usually have enough bass in them. What we want the kick drum to do, though, is maybe sometimes you want it to be a little bit of a darker kick drum or a brighter kick drum. So I'm not necessarily going to be adjusting the bass on a kick drum. I'm probably going to be more adjusting the frequencies higher than that. All right, so we've got here, let me just adjust this to make that picture brighter. So now we've got our short fader here. The short fader is, we've got a couple things going on here. Basically, the short fader is our level that's being sent. So it's our level that we can hear the input path, but it's also the level that's being sent over to our multi-track recorder. So think of this as like a water faucet. In your house, the water faucet, when you turn on the water faucet, how does that make the water come through? Well, what it does is your house, every house in the city has a water pressure that's happening all the time. There's a water pressure that's happening. So when you open that water faucet, it doesn't turn on a pump that sucks the water into your house. What it does is it just allows that water pressure to push the water through the water faucet. So that's why some houses, especially houses that are like, rooms that are like higher up, like on the 6th floor or 7th floor, and older buildings, the water pressure might not be so good, and so it's harder for that water to come through. I remember when I lived in London, I lived on the, not too high up, but it was the top floor of the building, and London's so old that water pressure was just non-existent in that building. And it was like, we always made a joke about that shower was like, it was like drooling on you. It was just like a drip of water. It was the worst shower experience I've had. And that's because the water pressure wasn't high enough. Well, the reason why I'm talking about that is because that's the same thing that's going on here. This fader here is not a gain knob. It doesn't add anything to your signal. What it does is you just have here, the 0 here is set. That's our unity level. That's the level you want to keep it at. And if you go above that, it's going to let more of that signal through. But 0 is where that sweet spot is for that signal. And that's basically where you want to keep it at. But if you turn it down, what you're doing is you're closing off the water faucet. So there's no water going to come through. There's no sound going to come through. And as you push that fader up, it opens it up so the sound is coming through. What's good about this is it means that these things are super, super clean. It's not like hurting your sound at all. So essentially, if I have my gain on my input pod set and I've got a good level coming up there, that level, it's just at the right point. I'm really happy with that level. It's not clipping, it's not too low, it's just in the sweet spot there. Well, if I want that same level to be sent to my multi-track recorder, I set this fader right here to 0. That's the short fader, and you set it to 0, and that's going to send your signal through to your multi-track recorder. If you do not turn up this fader here, you're not going to get signal in your multi-track recorder. All right, that's what this is for, really. And generally, you want to leave it set to 0, but when you're just checking your sound and you're just making sure the sound is fine before you're recording it, you can turn it down a little bit, because 0 might be a little bit too loud for your monitors, depending on what you have your monitors set to. Okay. So, so number one here is just setting between our mic and our tape input here. Is it going to be the monitor path or the input path, showing us what's coming into here? There's no button to push there. Number 2 can flip this to the source. So it can, this button here is a little bit confusing. I don't really want to go into this button too much, but you can have the monitor path comes into the short fader if you want, but I don't really want to talk about that because that can get confusing. It's something that you can do, but you shouldn't do unless you know what you're doing. So that's more advanced stuff. Number 3 is a pan knob for it, but again, you don't need to pan it like 9 times out of 10. You don't need to pan this. Number 4, you are going to use number 4 all the time. It's the mix button, and you're going to push this when you want to just check your level to make sure that what you think you're recording is in fact what you are actually recording. So if you think you've got like a trumpet player, it's like, right, and you got your trumpet, and you're like, you know what? I need to record this trumpet. So you set up the microphone and you turn the knob up, and you're hearing it, and you want to push that mix button. You want to push that mix button so that you're hearing it, to make sure it's not going. If it's happening like that, then that means that some kind of thing is a problem. Like there's usually some kind of a cable or something like that is a problem for you. So you got to make sure that that's not the case. That the trumpet you think you're hearing is what you're actually hearing, and that's why you want to use that mix button. Generally, you're not going to have the mix button pressed when you're doing the actual recording, because you're going to be listening to the monitor path. Remember, this is the input path. The input path is just to check it here. This mix button is just to check the signal to make sure it is what we think it should be. Make sure nothing's broken. Okay. Number 6 is the solo button if you want to solo it out. Number 7 is the cut button to cut it. All right. Move along here. And then Johan says WUITB. I have no idea what that means. All right. Anyway, we've got here this is our long fader here, and the long fader, remember, is our monitor path, and we can see the colors. It's a lighter color. The short fader was our input path, the darker color, and this is our monitor path, the lighter color here. And so after the signal goes to Pro Tools and it comes back from our computer, comes back into our Audient, then this is what we're going to use to actually monitor. So again, number 1 is the flip button to come from the tape or the mic. You're not going to touch this button. This button is essentially just, it's going to be the input path versus the monitor path. Again, I don't want you to get confused. I don't want you to touch this button. It's just, it is what it is. It's more advanced. If you get to a point where you think you need it, then we can talk. But probably you don't need it. Not at SAE, not at school. All right, so number 4 is our pan pot. You are going to use the pan knob to pan things around within our stereo spectrum. Number 3 sends the signal to the mix bus, which is what we're recording. So you almost always are going to have this button pressed. You do not want to have the mix button pressed on the long fader and the short fader at the same time, because that's going to be what we call double monitoring. It's not going to break anything, but it's going to sound weird. It's going to be a little bit of a flangey type of sound. Number 6 is the solo button. Number 5 is the solo button. Number 6 is the cut button. Cut essentially is your mute button. And then down here is the long fader. There's nothing really to talk about with the long fader here. Johnny says Jonathan Flores. Cool. All right. There we go. All right. So, any questions about this? If you do, I would say hold on to them till Zoom call, because it's a little bit easier to deal with questions in Zoom than it is here in Twitch. But if you have anything that's like just screaming at you and you need to know the answer right now, now would be the time to ask the question. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the master section here. So the master section, we have all these numbers associated on here for you. Let me just make sure this is okay. So here we got number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Number 1 is our stereo input section. Here, let's zoom in on that closer. There's our, oh wait. Here, let's get to number 1. There we go. There's number 1 in our master section picture here. This is our stereo input section. There are 4 stereo inputs, and these can be used for all sorts of stereo devices. What is a stereo input section? Well, essentially a stereo input section is just a section so you can bring in some extra stuff and not use channels on your mixer. There are more inputs on the mixer. As a matter of fact, the name of this mixer is the Audient ASP 8024. The 80 stands for 80 inputs, and the 24 stands for 24 outputs. So this would be 4 of those inputs there. We have 4 of them are the stereo inputs, and they can be used for all kinds of things: CD players, effects returns, keyboards, whatever you want, an MP3 player, something like that. So essentially it's like if you're in a studio and you need to reference another song while you're doing your mix, you would have that device, whatever it is, plugged into your stereo input, so you're not using your channels on your mixer. There's no EQs on the stereo inputs. They're just literally an input that has a knob there for how loud it can be. But they can go into the routing matrix, which means you could record them into your DAW and you could put an EQ on there. Now at SAE, the Alesis MIDI verb is normaled to stereo input number 1. Normaled means that's the default setup for that room. So if you want to have a reverb, just a real quick and dirty reverb at SAE on the Audient, you can send to aux number 1, which is our MIDI verb, and then that comes back into stereo input number 1. That's actually really, really important when you're using that room, but if you're not using that particular room, it's actually not important at all. Let's see. Number 2, let's see, do I have number 2? Yeah. Number 2 is the group out masters. So the group out masters are just levels for our group outs. So those buttons in the routing matrix to send the signal to our DAW, well, the level for those is all right here. And normally you're just going to leave it zeroed at 12 o'clock. You're just going to leave it at 12 o'clock because you don't want it to be less or more. The reason why we have group out master levels like this is because if you were doing a drum bounce to 2 channels, like let's say you have 8 channels of drums and you want to record those into your DAW at just 2 channels, all 8 of those channels would go to group outs numbers 1 and 2. Channel 1, the kick drum, 1 and 2. Channel, the snare drum, 1 and 2. Hi-hat, 1 and 2. Toms, 1 and 2. Overheads, 1 and 2. And then we can record those in, and that's when you would use that pan knob if you wanted to. But then let's say 1 and 2, everything's a little bit too quiet or everything's a little bit too loud and we're clipping the input coming into Pro Tools, then I can use my group out masters to adjust that level on the output for 1 and 2. Like I said, like 95% of the time you're not going to use these. Just leave them straight up and down and then pretty much don't worry about them. Directly beneath these, here is number 3. These are your aux masters. And the aux masters, when you zero out the board, they go all the way to the left. They do not stay up and down at 12 o'clock. These aux masters, they're very similar to the group out masters, except these are for your aux send levels. And you are going to make adjustments to these because if I have a whole bunch of different channels that are going to my reverb, for example, and reverb is aux number 1, well then I might be clipping the input of my reverb, and so I can just turn everything down a little bit so it's not clipping the input of the reverb, but everything still retains their each individual levels. So the Aux Send Masters, and you learned about these on the Mackie 1604. It's no different here. Please remember that whatever you learn about on the Mackie 1604 does apply to the Audient as well, and it also applies to the O2R and it applies to the SSL. It's just those boards add more bells and whistles, but essentially the same concepts apply. So for Aux Send Masters, these are master levels for the Aux Sends. Hey, it's weird how that happens with the names. You must turn these up when you are using an Aux Send. So zeroed out is all the way down to the left, and when it's in use, it's all the way up to, I usually put it at like 1 o'clock. All right, Stanley, you are here. Cool. All right, let's go back here. And let's talk about number 4 over here. Number 4 is our studio section. So this here is our studio section, number 4 in the master section. We have over here we got 2 sections to this. We got the speakers and the foldback. Most studios do probably not going to have speakers in their studio rooms. The bigger studios will, but home studios probably will not. That's like if you have speakers set up for the band when they finish playing, they're like, hey, we want to listen to that. They don't have to come all the way back into the control room to listen. They can just listen right there in the studio. But like I said, that is a luxury. It's not the norm. It's, you know, some studios have them, others don't. If you work in a studio that has them, great. If you don't work in a studio that has them, you're with good company, because most people don't have speakers in their studios. But the foldback section does have, most places do have like headphone mix capabilities. As a matter of fact, all you have to do is plug in a headphone cable into your board and you've got headphone mix capabilities. So what you want to do here is you want to see what you're going to send to it. So number 1 here is your studio source selection, studio room, and studio is the room where the musicians record, and you have your levels here, and then you get your on and off section here, and then you've got your foldback A section here. So you need to make sure the section's on, and you can solo A and B here, but if I zoom in on this, and let's zoom in here, and let's take a look at, this foldback A and B here. We've got, these are what are feeding into these parts here. So speakers A, B, they're all the same, and we're going to say, what are we sending to these sections? Okay, well, what we're sending most of the time is going to be, you know, depends on what you're doing, but it could be the control room or it could be aux A or B. If you're using the foldback section A and B, you're probably going to send from your auxes A and B, which is just your foldback section on the Audient. We talked about that earlier when we were talking about the auxes. It's part of the aux section, but it's not an aux. It's exactly the same as an aux, but it's for the foldback. It's essentially for a headphone mix. If your musicians in the studio just want to hear exactly what you're hearing in the control room, you push the control room button. That's a stereo button. If they wanted to hear just aux A and foldback A, then you're going to just push the aux A button and aux B button. Aux A is mono, aux B is also mono. If you wanted to give them a stereo signal, they'd have to press A in one and B in the other. But most of the time, you don't want to give them a stereo signal. If they're recording, they don't need a stereo signal. They can do fine with mono. So that's your level there. And when you are sending to your foldback section, you've got to make sure this level is up right here. But you also, check this out. Oops. You also want to make sure in number 3 here that your foldback section masters are up as well. And that's where people always get confused. They always will turn up number 4 here and then not number 3 for, you know, or whatever, or vice versa. So you have to make sure these are up here and these are up as well. So that's something to keep in mind there. All right, let's go on to number 5. Number 5 is our control room section. And again, this is just, if you haven't figured this out, this is pretty much just a review from yesterday, just a little bit of a deeper dive. So the control room section, again, just sets up what we're listening to in our control room. You've got the source select, which is, are we coming from the mix? 9 times out of 10, you're coming from the mix. What speakers are we going to listen to on the mains, alts 1, 2, 3, and alts 1 and 2 and 3? Again, we don't always have multiple speakers, especially at SAE, we don't have multiple speakers. We just have the main ones. So got these here, the main speakers. Here, let's go over here like this. The main speakers level is this knob right here, this big red knob here. But if you have other speakers, you would have their the level control is right here on these knobs here. You can press the button for these. You're not going to ever press more than one of these buttons at the same time. As a matter of fact, I don't think you can press more than one button at the same time. Down here, you got the mono mix button if you want to make your mix for mono. This would be if you want to check your phase cancellation, stuff like that. It's what we call mono compatibility. If you want to make sure that it sounds good in mono and in stereo, push that button. These days, it's not super common to be listening to stuff in mono. Most houses don't have mono speakers anymore. Most cars don't have mono speakers anymore. Only really, really old cars, really, really crappy cars would have mono speakers. Or really nice cars, but they're just old, would have mono speakers. So it's not something you have to worry about as much anymore. But if you're doing stuff for live situations, then you would want to think about the mono compatibility a lot more, because nightclubs might not always be wired the best. Although again, as we move further into the future, these things become less of an issue, and more nightclubs sound great, and they've got nice big stereo systems or quad systems even. So again, as we move further into the future, this becomes less of something that's a big deal, checking this mono compatibility. But you always do want to make sure that you're checking your mono compatibility, because you don't want your low end to do something weird, or you still want to check. Number 6 just mutes the left side or the right side, so you can see if there's any problems happening with the one side or the other side in your stereo spectrum. Number 8 is your cut button, which is essentially a mute button. And number 7 dims the signal. It doesn't turn it off, it just turns it down. So if you wanted to have a conversation, you could do that, and you could still be making sure that everything is recording nicely. All right. On a zeroed console, number 8 should be muted. You should push that in so it says cut. The cut light should be on when you zero out the console. Okay, so here we go. Number 7 again in the master section is our oscillator. Oscillator section makes the test tone for the troubleshooting. It doesn't really do a whole lot. It's just making that test tone. You can change the frequency, you can set the output, you can adjust the level, you can turn it on and off. Again, you don't really need to use this. You know, if you want to mess around with it just to see what it does, have at it. The solo section, solo level, solo versus other instruments, the mix amount, solo in place, and the after fader versus pre-fader levels. Basically, if you want to have it recording and not affect things, you'd push the pre-fader button down. And that way, if you're soloing stuff, it's still going to your multi-track recorder. It's not affecting that sound. Again, I don't really solo stuff too much while I'm recording, but that's me. All right, number 8 is our mix bus compressor. This affects everything going through the left-right mix bus, and it cannot be used on individual channels. So you have your gain reduction meter, you have your threshold, you have your attack, you have your ratio, you've got your makeup, and you've got your release. It's just a normal compressor. There's nothing special about it except for it's only on the mix bus. So if you want to record something through this compressor, you would have to literally bounce that thing down to a stereo left and right, and then bring it back into your mix later on as a bounced file. All right, and we talked about that stuff there. Sweet. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and stop this real quick.